Hello there, my name is Brandon and I make pictures out of tiny squares. And in this video I'm going to make some pixel art inspired by this comic. This is issue 21 of Spider-Man from 1992. This one's from a 6-issue arc by Eric Larson called Revenge of the Sinister Six. And in this particular issue, Spider-Man's been left on the brink of death, and when he awakes he finds himself rehabilitated with all these cyborg additions. I love how cool and just incredibly 90s this design is. And I'm going to put together a small scene for the moment where he first wakes up to find himself in his cyborg gear. I'm going to create this on a canvas of 152 by 152, which I pulled sort of randomly. Usually when I'm not sure what to use, I'll kind of default to some sort of square size canvas, just kind of thinking ahead about a typical Instagram post or something. But also these dimensions I chose because they're in a multiple of 8, which is the tile size that's used in a lot of retro consoles. And you'll see throughout this that I'm using that 8x8 grid to help assist me whenever I'm looking for decisions in the alignment and the sizing. Early on here, I'm just doing some rough silhouette work to get the placement of Spider-Man and the Doctor here. Their sprites are going to be facing each other, and then in the area below I'm going to put their character portraits and some dialogue for a small exchange, sort of like if this is a cutscene in a game. One of the things you'll notice about the sprite work I'm making here is that it's sort of like deformed or almost chibi style proportions. And the reason for that actually kind of came from the comic book as well, although in sort of an indirect way. One of the things that I find fun poking around in old comic books is finding those old full page advertisements. And in this issue, on the inside of the front cover, there's this ad for a Beetlejuice game for the Game Boy. I've never played this game. I don't think I even really particularly knew about it or anything. But at least from what I could see in the small printed screenshots, it looked like it had this fun and cartoony style, which makes sense because it's clearly based on that animated series. But it kind of served as some additional inspiration just in the style. Not like I wanted to totally Beetlejuiceify everything in the scene or anything like that, or even necessarily bring in the Game Boy look itself. But it was still just kind of a small piece that I brought into the stylization here. The other approach that I thought would help is that I'm creating all this line work first before adding the color. This is of course my most common workflow anyway, but it felt especially fitting here because as far as I know, that's exactly how they put together a traditional comic as well. Kind of doing the pencils and the inking and then adding the color as a later step. And the scene that I chose for here doing the detailing didn't have a ton of obvious environmental details to it. Spidey's clearly in some kind of futuristic procedure room. So I'm just filling this out with a bunch of tech details to convey that setting. And conveniently, those details are also providing this sort of vignetting around our characters in the center. So that kind of finishes out the line work. And then of course, the next step is going to be add the color. And I approached this by trying to think about what the minimum number of colors I'd require would be. So I kind of broke down the singular colors that I need to represent every bit of costume detail, such as the red, blue, and yellow for Spider-Man's costume. And then I'm going to pull a purple for the backdrop and then add in a black and white there, obviously for some generic use, which leads to a 6-color palette to start with. Now, it's pretty obvious how these selections will work for Spider-Man himself, but a little less obvious whether it'll suit the rest of the illustration too. One of the things that's important in the color selection of limited palettes like this is to try to plan ahead for pairings of tones as shades and highlights of each other, and to also think about the potential to multi-purpose each of those colors. So for instance, I thought about selecting a light enough yellow here so that it could double as the skin tone for the Doctor, and then the red for Spider-Man also becomes a shade tone for that skin tone. Just on his own, it kind of verges into Oompa Loompa territory, which I'm totally fine with, by the way. But overall, I really like how there's a strong contrast and vibrancy to this palette, and especially when continuing to mix and match and apply different highlights to these surfaces around the scene, it just pulls everything together. A certain color I realized was missing though was something to very subtly detail the backdrop here. So I introduced this kind of lighter pinky purple to use for that. For this detail work, I was just kind of freestyling some of these details based on my interpretation of the original comic design. There's nothing that's meant to be super recognizable. It's really just more of a pattern that has sort of the feel of being like tech and lights and screens and all that kind of stuff within the lab. So after I did a first good half of the room here, I copied that piece over to the other half of the room just to complete it. All right, now we're down in the lower portion of the drawing for the dialogue exchange. I'm starting here with a portrait of Spidey using a sizing of 24 by 32 pixels. And in contrast to the cartoony sort of sprites, this portrait ended up more closely resembling the comic book style in a way. I wasn't necessarily trying to stay away from that kind of stylization, but one of the tricky things with making pixel art of Spider-Man at low resolutions like this is just finding the right combo of angles and curves to get that iconic eye shape. So when I found it, I just kind of locked in. And then of course the other thing that's a bit of an issue is getting the web lines on the costume, since you're kind of limited to being a minimum of 1 pixel for those at least. In the end, I found room for a couple lines in there though, and I would just kind of break them up if they were merging with the other details in sort of a bad way. For the lettering, I'm using a sizing of 5 pixels wide by 6 pixels tall. And the reason for that, for the height, is because I'm going to italicize the letters. So what I do is, after building each letter in kind of an upright position, I shift it over at every 2 pixels of height. This approach often leaves you with a bit of cleaning up to do on the letter forms after, but I find it to be faster than designing italics totally from scratch. It's also pretty time consuming to draw out full sentences one letter at a time like this, so I tried to take the gist of what was being said in these couple of panels and sort of paraphrase it into just a few lines of dialogue. And we won't see it in this footage, but this is going to be animated too, so I eventually placed each letter on its own layer so that they could be toggled individually to kind of create a scrolling effect for them to appear on screen. Similarly, I'm working out an animation for the portrait to show up. So rather than just appearing suddenly or fading it with opacity, I'm selecting individual colors and replacing them with a color that's one step darker. So in this case, the red suit goes to purple and then to blue. And this way it appears like it's sort of getting darker and fading away before disappearing altogether. For the final frame of this transition, I've placed a sort of 1 pixel grid over the design to break it up even further. And back up in the scene itself, I'm giving a bit of movement to the Spider-Man sprite, just so it has a bit of life to it. And I'm starting here with some flapping on the headbands. I'm creating 3 unique headband positions by shifting around those individual segments that make up each strap. And once doing this to both straps, this is kind of the resulting effect. I know it's the kind of thing that would sort of suggest like a constant strong breeze within the room, but I just like the style of it. It makes it feel more hero-like, you know? And then similarly, I'm experimenting with an idle animation for the full sprite by segmenting the head and body to kind of raise and lower at different times. It's a bit of a cheaper way to get an animation started, but in this case we're working at this really low fidelity, so it felt somewhat on point for the style. And it was obviously a really quick way to add in some more character motion. The final touch here is sort of like a shock expression around his head. I guess similar in appearance to Spider-Sense sometimes, although in this case it's really just that he's surprised. I mean, the man's been made into a cyborg, so that makes sense. This pattern is just made of 2 unique frames that alternate back and forth. And that's going to be the last thing, so let's go ahead and take a look at the final artwork for Cyborg Spider-Man. Here we go. Alright, the only other thing I wanted to mention here was the late addition of the HUD here. This was added for a bit more of that retro game flavor, and it's kind of a small reference to the Spider-Man game for the Sega Genesis, which had labeled life and web meters like that. I'm sure other Spider-Man games probably do too, but I played that one a ton back in the day, so that's kind of what I was pulling from. So let's go ahead and close this out with some CRT time. This is one of those ones where I seem to get really lucky with the color selections. They turned out looking really nice on the CRT, so let's go take a look. And thank you for watching, and take care and keep it square.